On Capitol Hill, the focus was on video games, amid complaints that some of them promote the very thing that most people are trying to prevent. Video game manufacturers today issued something of a preemptive strike aimed at keeping violent and sexual images away from kids. NBC's John Cochran now.
The makers of some video games promote them as a way that guys can show how tough they are. But today, the game makers themselves blinked. Under pressure from an angry Congress and angrier parents, game makers offered a new rating system. GA for general audiences, all ages. MA13, okay for teens, but not younger kids. And MA17 for 17-year-olds and older. The timing of the peace offering was no accident. Just an hour later, the Senate began hearings on new legislation to prevent violent games from reaching kids. Senators were especially appalled by a game where a scantily clad woman is tortured.
It is a sick, disgusting video game, in my judgment. It's an effort to trap and kill women. Shame on people that produce that trash. It's child abuse, in my judgment.
The maker of the game says players can protect the victimized woman by winning the game.
Your job as the player is to identify the villains and to trap them.
Game makers admit ratings won't work unless stores and arcades enforce the new rules.
We can sit here all day and talk about morals, but the reality of the business world out there, and unfortunately in many cases, is driven by economics.
Some makers say playing games with simulated violence may actually help some teenagers who can release pent-up feelings, a theory other witnesses disputed.
How would you like to have a teenage daughter go out on a date with someone who's just watched or played 3 hours of that game?
Not much, said the senators, who vowed to press ahead with tough legislation unless the $6 billion a year video game industry cleans up its act soon. John Cochran, NBC News, Washington.
A fantasy martial arts game that some parents think is just too violent for their kids. Carol Lynn joins us live now from Northridge with more on that story. Carol?
Here it is, Bob, behind me. It's called Mortal Kombat, and we're going to talk to Aaron Brandis here about the game. Aaron, how does it work?
Well, basically, you pick a couple characters, you do maneuvers on the joystick, some buttons, you do moves, and
then what are you trying to get to? Fatalities?
Nah, there's a master guy you got to beat at the end. Fatalities are just what happens if you're really brutal to your opponent. You get an opponent, you can rip off his head or something like that.
Sounds like a pretty thrilling game, and this is the kind of violence that critics are pretty worried about. Cold-blooded murder is making Mortal Kombat the most popular video game in history. Kids relish their victory and their bloody choice. Should they pull out their opponent's heart? Or simply rip his head off just to see his spinal cord dangle in a pool of blood? How do you feel about cutting his head off? After a $10 million advertising campaign, Mortal Kombat, debuting in home video today, is expected to sell 2 million copies at $50 a pop. A horrifying possibility for parents who can't believe the game makers are fantasizing about decapitation and murder.
I don't think they'll have this at home, no.
You don't think so?
A little bit too violent.
You look a little startled.
Yeah, it's a little too violent, I think.
That's pretty bad. That's just plain gross. Furthermore, advanced technology allows digitized video of real martial arts actors, making the action look real and not as cartoony. In fact, Mortal Kombat so shocked the managers at a nationwide arcade chain that they tried a sanitized version of the game. Instead of chopping the opponent's head off, he simply disappears. Sales dropped 40%.
They came up and said, what'd you do to the game? It's no fun anymore.
Kids are saying chill out to worried parents.
I think TV personally influences more than a video game. A video game is a video game.
The bottom line, parents wonder if kids can separate fantasy from the real thing.
Wait until they get out in a situation where they're fighting, and then they'll think about this and try to make it real.
But you know, game makers are saying that games are going to become more visually violent and more sexually violent as adults buy more video games. I mean, it's a big money market, $50 to $60 a pop. Plus, some of the critics say, or they at least concede, that parents have to be there in order to pay for the game, so at least there's some discretion there. And game makers are also talking about a new rating system similar to the movies. We'll see what happens. I'm Carol Lynn reporting live from Northridge. Back to you. All right.
This is Sega's Mortal Kombat. Lots of blood, lots of heads rolling. This is being called Mortal Monday because Nintendo has also issued a version of Mortal Kombat today.
It's a one-on-one fighting game. You begin by facing your opponent one-on-one and using special weapons or kicks or punches to defeat him.
On the left, Bill Malice, video game aficionado. On the right, Rose Dyson of Canadians concerned about violence in entertainment.
I can either punch him over, knock him over, or completely finish him by punching his head off.
When you take a look at all this, you have to wonder, is Mortal Kombat really suitable for kids?
It's training them to enjoy and like violence as a form of conflict resolution.
This is a fantasy. This is not reality. And I don't believe people could punch somebody's head off if they tried.
Mellis says a U.S. study shows people who play video games are less violent and less likely to have a heart attack because the games are an outlet for pent-up frustrations.
The mere idea that you would enjoy blowing your opponent's head off is a problem.
I bought this game because it contains the blood and violence that was represented in the arcade version.
Comes to $80.12.
There's certainly no indication of any kind of boycott of Mortal Kombat. In fact, by the time this store closes tonight, they expect to have sold more than 200 copies. And this is the game's first day on sale. Stu Patterson, CBC News, Toronto.
Concerns today over the violence in a new video game about to be released in Australia. A Labor senator has criticised the Sega company for bringing out the product before a proper warning system is in place.
We've come a long way since Donkey Kong and the early Mario brothers. Video game technology and content have changed dramatically. This all-party Senate committee increasingly alarmed at the growing trend to graphic violence.
No way in which parents can have any assurances about the type of material that their children are having access to.
Games like this one, Mortal Kombat, don't pull any punches. The parliamentary watchdog worries that, unlike America and Britain, video games sold here aren't subject to any controls over violence, in particular this game, Night Trap. It's about to be released in Australia, despite importer Sega earlier assuring the committee it would wait until a new classification system was in place.
I'm extremely disgusted with Sega for making this preemptive decision.
Sega changed its mind after talking to the Film Classification Board.
Games like Night Trap should be available. Whether young children play those games, I guess, is up to the parents.
A classification system for video games still needs approval from state and federal governments. Sega claims it's got its own warning system ready to go. But when it comes to Night Trap, Senator Reynolds is still worried.
Who wants to be involved in a game that involves that form of mutilation?
Peter Harvey.
Christmas stocking. Video games have become a $4 billion a year business, and a great many children, as you parents know, have put them on their Christmas lists. As ABC's Bill Greenwood reports, there is a growing concern on Capitol Hill that parents who buy some of those games may not realize just how much violence they're getting.
One of the most vicious games is called Mortal Kombat. The objective is to finish off your opponent violently. Another method is decapitation. Critics, including the National PTA, say such video games contribute to violence in real life. And television's Captain Kangaroo says parents are not paying enough attention.
Understand that these are not harmless toys, that they can indeed cause great emotional and other damage to a child.
Congress will be asked to establish a rating system to protect children from gruesome games.
We now require warning labels on toys that can potentially damage children's bodies. Why not do so on a toy that can damage their minds?
Barry Rhodes bought the game anyway, since it takes a special code to activate the violent scenes, which he says are a part of life.
It's there, so I'm not going to try to hide my daughter from that.
Even so, the giant Sega Corporation recently introduced a voluntary system to rate video games for use by a general audience, those over 13 and over 17. But there are lots of places where youngsters can play video games without such guidance or adult supervision. So next week, the U.S. Senate will conduct hearings on ways to supervise the video industry. Bill Greenwood, ABC News, Washington.
And that is our report on World News Tonight. Later on.
Questions. Mr. White, in the rating system that Sega has, beyond the MA-17, MA-13, and the rest, you have a category non-approval. Yes. So that that's indication on the guidelines themselves that Sega has established that that you profess an intention to exercise some self-control here. And I read from the latest version of the guidelines, which is December 2nd of 1993. As always, Sega will not approve products which contain A1, material that encourages criminality of any kind. Every day, the news brings more and more images of random violence, torture, and sexual aggression right into our living rooms. Violence and violent images permeate more and more aspects of our lives. And I think it's time to draw the line. I know that one place parents want us to draw the line is with violence in video games. The fact is that a new generation of video games crosses that line, containing the most horrible depictions of graphic violence and sex, including particularly violence against women. Like the Grinch who stole Christmas, these violent video games threaten to rob this particular holiday season of a spirit of goodwill. Instead of enriching a child's mind, these games teach a child to enjoy inflicting torture. For those who have not seen these so-called games before, I want to show you what we're talking about. What you're about to see are scenes from two of the most violent new video games. First, we have Mortal Kombat, which is a martial arts contest involving digitized characters. We're going to show two versions of the game. In the first segment, which is Sega's version, blood splatters from the contestants' heads. When a player wins, the so-called death sequence begins. The game narrator instructs the player to finish, quote, finish his opponent. The player may then choose a method of murder, ranging from ripping a heart out to pulling off the head of the opponent with spinal cord attached. For a lot of you to see, but there's blood splattering every time.
Kato wins. Flawless victor fatality. Sub-Zero win fatality.
The second game is Night Trap, which is a game set in a sorority house. The object is to keep hooded men from hanging the young woman from a hook or drilling their necks with a tool designed to drain their blood. Night Trap uses actual actors and achieves an unprecedented level of realism. What is particularly troubling about the scene in this film that we have an extract of is a graphic depiction of the violence against women with strong overtones of sexual violence. I find this segment deeply offensive and believe that it simply should be taken off the market.
Megan, this isn't gonna work. You're not scaring me. Wait. What are you doing now? Megan, no!
Pleased that the video game business by this action has shown that it recognizes that there's a problem here. A credible rating system will help parents determine which games are appropriate for children of different ages, and that is exactly what our proposed legislation contemplates. But I must say here that creating a rating system is, in my opinion, the very least the video game industry can do, not the best they can do.
Mortal Kombat and Night Trap are not the kind of gifts that responsible parents give. Night Trap, which adds a new dimension of violence specifically targeted against women, is especially repugnant. It ought to be taken off the market entirely, or at the very least, its most objectionable scenes should be removed. But those games are only two examples. Let me tell you about another video game called Lethal Enforcers. It comes with a special piece of hardware, an oversized handgun called the Justifier. What does this game seem to teach our kids? Basically, that a gun can solve any problem. With Lethal Enforcers, sometimes the player hits innocent bystanders. In that case, blood splatters to the ground. But what the heck? Bystanders need to learn to get out of the way. Make no mistake about it, Lethal Enforcers is aimed at young kids. Just look at the ad. The warning label is almost entirely obscured, but enormous guns dominate the package. The ad features more than 20 guns in all, and the lead of the ad says, "You won't find a toy like this in any Cracker Jack box." Well, I hope not. What a cynical, irresponsible way to market a product.
That you've established to make a game that puts this in the hand of a child and rewards his skill at shooting at the television screen. And the characters in it, including, as Senator Cole said, innocent bystanders who, when hit, are pumped back and bleed.
Senator, we rely on the independent rating council to help us make those decisions because we at corporate are not psychologists, we're not sociologists, we do not understand the detail of that research that was discussed at the first panel. We rely on experts to help make those decisions. And they have rated that product MA-17, only appropriate for adults. I may also point out that Sega produces product for a rapid-fire machine gun that uses the same technology, to our understanding, with several games available, and they have no rating on that product to suggest that product's for adults.
Nintendo produces that, you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's a similar device. It's a bazooka rather than a handgun.
And what is the game is that for a video game? Mr. Lincoln, do you want to?
This is a thing that comes with the, or can be purchased with the Super NES. It obviously doesn't quite look like what you've got in your hands. It's called the Super Scope. The gun that you have in your hand is called the Justifier. I think that this game is a target shoot. This device is for target shooting and whatnot. I guess I'd rest my case with the fact that we're not putting the name Justifier on it. And the game that you're speaking of, Lethal Enforcer, let me tell you that that game was initially rejected by Nintendo. We told the licensee that we would not allow that game on the market.
Right.
We told him that he would told it that they would have to take off the word Justifier, and we made a number of substantial changes to it. And we also told him we wouldn't approve this kind of packaging. The end result is that that product is not yet out on the Nintendo platform.
I hope before it goes out on the market, you'll think again about it, because it's more than the name Justifier on this. This is a handgun, pure and simple. And no matter what the name is on it, putting it in the hands of a kid just gives them the wrong idea. As I must say, to me that looks like a weapon, and not like a high-tech implement of any kind. It looks like an assault weapon of some kind. Let me go to another part of this problem, and that is the chain of distribution, the chain of advertising. Because if you establish a rating system, it's got to be carried out throughout the chain. As you indicated earlier, I went into, one of my staff members this morning went into a Toys R Us on the way to work, and Night Trap is right there alongside the other video games that the kids can buy. I want to show you two examples that deal with advertising. The first is this Toys R Us circular, and if you can see it, I think you'll see, Mr. White, in that case, that the ratings on Mortal Kombat are not visible. They've been covered over. Now, I know that's not your ad. You don't own Toys R Us, but I'm just trying to make the point of how important it is if you're really going to rely on your rating system to follow that through the chain. Second, we've got this ad for Lethal Enforcer that Senator Cole has pointed to before, and the rating, which is on your package, is effectively it's not visible. The carton is raised in such a way that it's covered it up. And of course, apart from that, and you'd have to look for it, I mean, one other exercise of responsibility here would have been simply to have had a mark somewhere else there saying this is MA-17. This shouldn't be bought or used by anyone under the age of 17. So my question is this. Pursuant to your commitment to have a rating system, would you commit now to do everything in your power to ensure that the ratings are not only visible on your product, but visible in advertising for your product, especially advertising, of course, which you procure directly? Mr. White and Mr.
Yes,
Lincoln.
Chairman Lieberman, I refer to my written testimony that we are, in fact, suggesting that consistency as to the presentation of ratings and product packaging, advertising, and promotional materials, and I'll go beyond that and suggest that it should be prominent, and you have our commitment. I don't believe that that same commitment has been made by Nintendo. It is in our testimony.
Mr. Lincoln.
Well, I don't know what he's talking about there. As you well know, we have made a commitment to the rating system. The point that I've been making all along, and the point that I made to both of you this morning individually, was that we are concerned that a rating system by itself might just be an open season on more violent games.
About 2 months ago, I saw the video game Night Trap for the first time. It is a sick, disgusting video game, in my judgment. It's an effort to trap and kill women. Shame on people that produce that trash. It's child abuse, in my judgment.
Night Trap, which adds a new dimension of violence specifically targeted against women, is especially repugnant. It ought to be taken off the market entirely, or at the very least, its most objectionable scenes should be removed.
It has been quite a leap from Pac-Man to Night Trap. About 2 months ago, I saw the video game Night Trap for the first time. It is a sick, disgusting video game, in my judgment. It's an effort to trap and kill women. Shame on people that produce that trash. It's child abuse, in my judgment. And I know there'll be people who say, well, we sit up here as the thought police, trying to suggest what people can see or do. It's not my intention. We have some basic responsibility in this country to protect children.
Dr. Provenzo?
I think there are a couple of things. One is that a lot of people in the industry say that these things simply reflect what's in the culture. I think that by manufacturing games like Night Trap, what in point of fact these manufacturers are doing are endorsing that violence. And I think that's really objectionable.
And a woman since the day I was born. And let me tell you, on all my labels and all the hats I wear, I find that so extremely offensive, and the only word you can say to the manufacturers and the shareholders of the company is shame on you. And I think that they really should stop and think about what they're doing. I mean, how would you like to have a teenage daughter go out on a date with someone who's just watched or played 3 hours of that game?
Senator Lieberman.
Thank you, Senator Cole, and thanks to all the members of the panel. Just hearing what you've said now, we're also repelled. We're disgusted by this material, and yet it is a measure of our values in this society that we resist the impulse to do what I think, let me say for myself, I'd like to do. I'd like to be able to pass a law saying you can't produce this stuff anymore. We don't do that because we value our freedoms. But with those rights that the producers of video games in this case have also come responsibilities, and that's been the partner to rights in our society. And I think what we're all saying is that we don't feel that this particular industry has carried out those responsibilities in the way that they should, and now's the time to change. And it's been my experience with my kids and other kids that it is true that I'm curious as to whether any of you know whether this is true, that boys tend to play these games much more than girls. Young boys tend to play much more than girls. Therefore, when I see the obvious sexual aggression against the woman in Night Trap, which kids do have access to, I worry that we're not only perpetuating the gender stereotypes we talked about in terms of skills, but we're running the risk of increasing the probability that these boys who are playing these games are going to be more sexually aggressive and abusive as a result of the experiences they've had with the games. Now, again, that's a personal, non-professional reaction. Is there anything in the literature or in your experience or studies to suggest that that's true?
And I think some of the stuff in terms of the type of thing you're saying here, I mean, look at the portrayal of the woman there in the image from Night Trap. I mean, there are obviously sexual overtones operating there to a large degree.
I thought I was moved by your statement, which is one that parents must all feel, which is they wouldn't want their daughters going out with a boy who had just been playing one of these video games.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Provenzo, you indicated that in your book, and I know you have in your book, state that video games are not only violent and sexist, but they're also racist. Can you just briefly give us a few examples of what you mean?
Sure. In interviews with children, what I found was that they talked about the ninjas as being bad. And then you asked them who the ninjas were, and they were sort of like the Japs and the Chinese. And it turns out that they perceive Asians, any Asian, as being extremely violent, as being dangerous, as being evil. It's operating at a very basic level and at times simplistic. It carries over into other areas as well. There is depictions, I believe, although it's hard to prove, but my perception of homophobia operating in terms of how certain types of women are portrayed. I think that there are also things about race in terms of black and color issues that are clearly there. They're subtle and they're hard to get at sometimes, but I think they present a rather disturbing world.
Senator Dorian. Thank you very much. Ms. Droz, we have testimony that will be submitted later, some of which has already been submitted by Mr. Tom Zito, who's not with us, President and CEO of... I'm sorry, Mr. Zito is here. I see. Okay, Mr. Zito has presented testimony. Mr. Zito says that Night Trap was set out to create a spoof of vampire films. And then Mr. White from Sega, Vice President of Sega, who will testify in the next panel, says in 5 mitigating points responding to the controversy over Night Trap, is that the controversial scene, apparently the one we've just seen and the one I've seen before, is displayed only when the game player loses. Does that make you feel any better?
Oh, it makes me feel a lot better that if you're losing, you're dead. No, it doesn't. We're dealing with self-esteem in here. There are many magazines out on the market, like the several I brought in here today. These magazines are filled with game tips on how to play the game, that in no time at all children become winners in kill, and their kill ratio goes up. It tells them the secret codes and exactly what to do to become successful in murder.
Commander Sims, at the beginning of Night Traps, looks at you straight in the eye and he says, quote, "If you don't have the brains or guts for this mission, then give control to someone who does." That's what it says at the beginning of the game.
If you don't have the brains or the guts for this assignment, give the controls to someone who does.
The head of the SWAT team, or excuse me, it's the SCAT. It's the Sega something or other, SWAT team is what it comes down to. So there's this sort of fascist military type with a, police cap on looking at you and saying, if you're not man enough to do this, forget it, You don't deserve to play this game.
So obviously it's not directed for the other half of the population.
This, Mr. Zito, in his testimony also says
The only thing worse than a violent video game is the even more frightening suggestion of censorship. I understand his concern about censorship, and I guess since in the 13 years that I've served here in the United States Congress, that you will not find a congressional record that I've left that represents a belief in censorship. I think censoring what people can say or see or do or think is a trail that's a long, tortured, dangerous trail. I don't know exactly what the solution is, but I know that to those who produce Night Trap, my personal observation is I think it's pathetic and shameful that the conclusion of a game like that, a quote game unquote, is to drill into a woman's neck, to grab a woman with a metal hook. I mean, I don't view that as constructive entertainment. Now, should we censor it? I don't believe much in censorship, but moving down the road to try to find how do we prevent children from having access to that sort of glorification of violence, and I agree with Senator Lieberman, a violence I think that is directed all too often against women.
In the past years, some very violent and offensive games have reached the market. And of course, I'm speaking about Mortal Kombat and Night Trap. And let me say that for the record, I want to state that Night Trap will never appear on a Nintendo system. Obviously, it would not pass our guidelines. This game, which as you've indicated, promotes violence against women, simply has no place in our society.
Thank you all. Mr. White, let me begin with you, and I suppose in one sense go to the heart of the matter. We saw the clip before from Night Trap with the woman being attacked, and I said earlier that I thought that violence was gratuitous and offensive and ought not to be available to people in our society. Mr. Lincoln, just here a few moments ago, as Vice President of the other leading company in this field, Nintendo, said, and I quote, "This game simply has no place in our society." Why don't you agree? Why doesn't Sega just pull Night Trap off the market?
I think, Senator, with all due respect, the point I tried to make in my oral arguments and testimony was that this industry, as part of the interactive media industry, has grown tremendously. The children represent only a portion of the audience that we try to serve with our interactive software. Night Trap was developed specifically for an adult audience. Sega took a leadership position in establishing an independent rating council and appropriately labeled Night Trap MA-17, not appropriate for children. And we believe, just as Congress has treated the motion picture industry, that we as an industry should have an opportunity to regulate ourselves, and believe that we've taken that first step this morning in developing an industry-wide coalition to adopt an industry rating system with enforcement.
I must say that the exercise of responsibility, do you think it's even appropriate for you to be pushing that stuff out there for adult audiences to use? I mean, it's...
Well, I think it's
with
appropriate.
the way in which the woman is attacked. I mean, clearly she's dressed provocatively. She's brutally attacked by the people dressed in dark clothes there. Is that... Why even... You've mentioned a list of products that your company produces. A lot of them are great. Why do you need to go across that line and produce this stuff for adults or kids?
Let me make 2 points. First, if you showed only the violent and gory scenes from out of context consecutively, one after the other, from Roots or Gone with the Wind, you might conclude they're horrible films. But in reality, they aren't. And what you've done is picked a particular segment of that game. Let me clarify. A winning effort within Night Trap saves the women. Your job as the player is to identify the villains and to trap them. If you are a good player, you keep the villains from the women and men who are potential victims. This game is an appropriate game for adults that choose to entertain themselves in this way, shape, and form.
And if you're a bad player, what happens?
If you're a bad player, you will see that scene.
The woman gets attacked.
The woman gets attacked.
You're going to have a long way to go to convince me that you're raising anyone's values or reducing anyone's inclination toward aggression, and particularly aggression toward women, by putting this on the market?
We agree with much of what was said on the earlier panel. We believe that more research is necessary to conclude the effect that these games are having on both adults and children. The point
well, why don't you
we want to make is that
until the research is done.
Until the research is done, we feel it's an appropriate step to develop an industry-wide rating system which has enforcement that will allow adults, which represent 60% of the players for the Sega CD system, to make the choice as to whether or not that game is right or wrong for them.
My question is, I guess my point is that I appreciate the rating system that you've adopted, and I guess my question is, would you accept the responsibility to try to make sure that every link in the chain that Nintendo is involved in, such as the advertisements and the brochures that we've discussed with Mr. White, follows out carries out your desires with the rating system?
Well, we'll certainly do that. You know, the point that I'm making, Senator, is that the game ratings, it just doesn't go far enough. We have to get our hands on the game content. And we've been doing that, but like any other system, it's not perfect. Let me make just a couple of other points. I can't sit here and allow you to be told that somehow the video game business has been transformed today from children to adults. It hasn't been, and Mr. White, who is a former Nintendo employee, knows the demographics as well as I do. Furthermore, I can't let you sit here and buy this nonsense that this Sega Night Trap game was somehow only meant for adults. The fact of the matter is, this is a copy of the packaging. There was no rating on this game at all when the game was introduced. Small children bought this at Toys R Us, and he knows that as well as I do. When they started getting heat about this game, then they adopted the rating system and put ratings on it. But today, just as I'm sitting here, you can go into a Toys R Us store or a Walmart or a Kmart, and you know as well as I do that you can buy this product, and no one, certainly no sales clerk at retail, is going to challenge you. So the point I'm getting at is putting these ratings on, if that's as far as we're going to go, isn't going to get us anywhere. We've got to get further into this. And let me say that I agree.
Well, thank you. Thanks for your forthrightness. Thanks for assuming responsibility. I believe you've shown some leadership here. You're not perfect, as you've said, but you've been a damn sight better than the competition.
Senator, make a comment, please.
Today, Mr. Lincoln, on behalf of Nintendo, has accepted the idea of a rating system. They have previously been self-regulating more than you have. They chose not to produce Night Trap, and they have a clearly less violent version of Mortal Kombat out. You have a rating system, but I've still not today heard you accept responsibility for regulating the content of your games more than you already are.
In a typical video arcade, I saw one before Thanksgiving at the mall in Minneapolis, the largest mall of America, I believe they call it. Would you find Mortal Kombat, Night Trap?
You wouldn't find Night Trap, no. To my knowledge, I've certainly never seen Night Trap out in the commercial version.
Would you find Sega's version of Mortal Kombat in that arcade?
Well, in the coin-op, Mortal Kombat is not put out by either Sega or Nintendo. It's put out by a Illinois company.
Is there any supervision in those arcades that you're aware of? I mean, the reason I ask the question is I don't see a bunch of college sophomores crowding that arcade. I saw a bunch of kids playing video games. And the question is, if you've got video arcades where kids spend hours playing video games, is there any basis for believing that some of the more violent games are out of the reach of young children? In my judgment,
no,
not.
Absolutely not. Night Trap, as an example, is not a coin-op piece. It is not out in coin-op. If you look through the list of the pieces that are available for the home market and the children, the vast majority of those are not out in coin-op.
Do you just say, well, here we're going to lay this on the market and let the buyer beware? If some kid can get access to it, fine. I understand that when Night Trap was released, it was not rated. And I might be wrong, but I understand that the first time you rated it at the 13 level. Is that not correct?
You're wrong, Senator. I'm sorry. The rating system went into effect in June. It was rated for the first time, and it was rated MA-17, and it was produced with that label on it from that point forward.
With respect to the question of the video arcade and the video games in which a woman is grabbed by the neck with a hook and drilled in the neck with a tool, and someone grabs the heart out of a character, we ought to have just as much concern about protecting our children against that sort of trash as we have in dozens of other areas in protecting our children. And I honestly, Mr. White, I read your statement, and I honestly think that you don't understand what we're talking about here. Let me tell you why. In your final point about Night Trap, you say this: finally, there is some research suggesting a short-term, momentary increase in playful, aggressive behavior after playing video games or watching violent television programs. There is no research concluding that this has any lasting impact. In fact, quite the opposite is true, you say.
As you indicated earlier, I went into, one of my staff members this morning went into a Toys R Us on the way to work, and Night Trap is right there alongside the other video games that the kids can buy. I want to show you two examples that deal with advertising. The first is this Toys R Us circular, and if you can see it, I think you'll see, Mr. White, in that case, that the ratings on Mortal Kombat are not visible. They've been covered over. Now, I know that's not your ad. You don't own Toys R Us, but I'm just trying to make the point of how important it is if you're really going to rely on your rating system to follow that through the chain. Second, we've got this ad for Lethal Enforcer that Senator Cole has pointed to before, and the rating, which is on your package, is effectively it's not visible. The carton is raised in such a way that it's covered it up. And of course, apart from that, and you'd have to look for it, I mean, one other exercise of responsibility here would have been simply to have had a mark somewhere else there saying this is MA-17. This shouldn't be bought or used by anyone under the age of 17. Final question for Mr. White and the panel. In your guidelines, you say that you're not going to approve products which contain material that denigrates any ethnic, racial, sexual, or religious group. Obviously, I think that Night Trap denigrates a sexual group, namely women. So my question is this. Pursuant to your commitment to have a rating system, would you commit now to do everything in your power to ensure that the ratings are not only visible on your product, but visible in advertising for your product, especially advertising, of course, which you procure directly? Mr. White and Mr.
Yes,
Lincoln.
Chairman Lieberman, I refer to my written testimony that we are, in fact, suggesting that consistency as to the presentation of ratings and product packaging, advertising, and promotional materials, and I'll go beyond that and suggest that it should be prominent, and you have our commitment. I don't believe that that same commitment has been made by Nintendo. It is in our testimony.
Mr. Lincoln.
Well, I don't know what he's talking about there. As you well know, we have made a commitment to the rating system. The point that I've been making all along, and the point that I made to both of you this morning individually, was that we are concerned that a rating system by itself might just be an open season on more violent games. The commitment that I'll make to you is that we will, while we will participate in formulating a rating system, we'll be the first ones back here if what we see is nothing more than just business as usual. If we're going to have a rating system, let's put some meat in it. Let's figure out a way to get the retailers to enforce it. Let's figure out a way that that the consumer can clearly understand the content of these games, and we'll certainly make that commitment. I've made that to you prior to the hearing in my statement, and I'll repeat it now.
Thank you. Ms. Rosenthal, on behalf of the Software Publishers Association, am I correct that Konami would be a member of the association?
Excuse me, Your Honor. I'm sorry, Mr. Senator.
It's okay.
I do not believe that company is a member.
Would you consider it a software publisher, whether it's a member or not?
I'm truthfully not familiar with that.
Okay, but let me, notwithstanding that, let me just get to ask you whether, on behalf of your association, you would commit here as part of the implementation of a rating system to do everything within your power to prominently display the ratings in advertising your members may procure and promotional materials that you put out?
Absolutely. Senator Lieberman, you've made some very, very cogent points here. And what I want to emphasize today is the sincerity of the industry. They have heard what you and Senator Cole have had to say, and they are sincerely interested in the well-being of children. And any system, rating system that does get adopted will be consistent and will be understandable and will be labeled in a similar manner and will be enforceable. That's a commitment that we can make to you.